Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're doing something a little different. We're unpacking the exact life cycle of a public policy. I'm talking about how a localized, everyday grievance actually enters the giant machinery of governance and transforms into concrete government action. Let's get right into it.
Take a second and think about the visible issues right in your own community. Maybe it's youth unemployment, maybe it's air pollution clouding up the skyline, or even just a lack of basic public health resources. We all see these problems, right? But how does the government machine actually process them? How does a simple complaint turn into a law and eventually a concrete on-the-ground solution? Well, there is a highly structured life cycle for these ideas, and today we're going to map the whole thing out. Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap for today. We're breaking this down into 5 quick chapters: decoding public policy, who influences the process, designing the solution, from paper to practice, and finally, did it actually work? Starting right off with Chapter 1, Decoding Public Policy. So before we get into the real-world nitty-gritty of laws and budgets, we kind of need to zoom out a bit. At its core, public policy is simply the process through which the government identifies public problems and takes action to solve them. It's not just a one-off event, actually. It's a continuous, highly systematic process that's ultimately meant to promote public welfare. You can almost think of this as a hero's journey, or maybe an assembly line that every single policy idea has to survive. It's a 6-stage life cycle: agenda setting, policy formulation, policy adoption, policy implementation, policy evaluation, and then finally, maintenance, modification, or termination. It's a chain, and honestly, if a policy skips even one step, the whole system can completely break down. Moving on to Chapter 2, Who influences the process? Now, obviously, this process doesn't just happen in a vacuum or run on autopilot in some isolated back room. It relies heavily on policy networks. And this is a massive interconnected web of influence. It includes government officials and political parties, sure, but it also pulls in interest groups, NGOs, subject matter experts, the media, and yes, everyday citizens. Literally everyone, from environmental scientists studying pollution data to activists holding a rally, pulls at the strings of these policy decisions. So it's a deeply collaborative and, sometimes combatant environment. Now, what's really interesting about this is how political ideologies act like a lens that completely shifts a government's spending priorities. Look at these 2 contrasting paths. A welfare-oriented government might look at a problem and decide, hey, we need to heavily increase public spending on education and healthcare. But on the flip side, a market-oriented government might look at the exact same economic landscape and push for privatization as the ultimate solution. And neither is right or wrong in our analysis here. It just goes to show how political beliefs fundamentally dictate the type of policy that gets written.
Which brings us right to policy framing. Because the exact way an issue is described fundamentally changes public opinion and media coverage. Communication literally shapes reality here. For example, presenting climate change strictly as an environmental crisis triggers one very specific type of response. But if you frame it as an economic issue, focusing on lost jobs or creating new green technology markets, that completely changes who pays attention and how the policy is ultimately drafted.
Let's move to Chapter 3 and see how this builds: designing the solution. All right, this is where we enter the first actual stages of that assembly line we talked about: spotting a crisis and dreaming up the fix. This is Stage 1, agenda setting, and Stage 2, policy formulation. First, an issue, let's say rising youth unemployment, becomes so incredibly loud through public demand or media coverage that the government is forced to put it on their immediate agenda. Then, in the formulation stage, they don't just guess at a fix. Experts consult, research is conducted, and a whole bunch of policy alternatives are compared. Like, if the issue is pollution, they're going to study different methods to reduce it before ever selecting the single best intervention.
I also really want to highlight that today's policy formulation involves intense global pressure. An idea isn't just shaped by domestic needs anymore. International treaties and trade agreements directly dictate a country's internal agenda. A great example of this from our source material is India. Their domestic climate policies are heavily influenced by the international climate agreements they participate in. The world stage constantly influences the local stage.
So the government has found a solution, but how does it become official and real? That's Chapter 4, From Paper to Practice.
And this brilliantly illustrates Stages 3 and 4, adoption and implementation. On Day 1, the government officially approves the policy. Say Parliament actually passes a law to reduce plastic pollution. Fast forward to Day 30, we're firmly in implementation. Government departments are already allocating funds and assigning responsibilities. By day 60, the Ministry of Environment is actively enforcing those plastic ban regulations on the ground. So it's a rapid pipeline from a legislative vote all the way to physical, on-the-ground enforcement.
But the crucial point here is that a policy is only as good as the people executing it. This is bureaucratic influence. You can have the most beautifully written law in the history of the world, but the experience at administrative scale of government officials, like district collectors in India implementing welfare schemes, for example, that ultimately determines if the policy thrives or dies out there in the real world. They are the actual engine of implementation.
And because governments are strategic, they rarely just launch a massive new initiative blindly. They rely on policy innovation and experimentation. So, before a huge nationwide rollout, they test new ideas on a small scale. Think about testing digital governance projects in just a few selected pilot districts. This lets the bureaucrats find the bugs, gather early feedback, and figure out what actually works before risking the entire country's budget on it.
You also can't implement a policy quietly. Clear, effective communication is absolutely crucial during implementation to secure public cooperation. We saw a perfect example of this during the COVID-19 vaccination campaigns. The government had to run massive, nonstop awareness campaigns to inform people about safety measures and vaccine availability. Without that vital communication piece, the implementation would have just fallen apart.
Which brings us to the final phase. Chapter 5. Did it actually work?
This is the rigorous quality control phase of the Policy Factory Stage 5 policy evaluation. The government doesn't just pass a law and walk away, right? They actively check if the policy achieved its objectives. They collect data, they utilize researcher insights, and they gather citizen feedback. So if they implemented a plastic ban back in Stage 4, Stage 5 is where they sit down and measure whether pollution levels actually decreased. They're looking for the policy's real-world strengths and, just as importantly, its hidden weaknesses.
And that rigorous evaluation leads us straight to Stage 6, the ultimate decision. If a scheme is successful, it goes into maintenance. It keeps going. If it just needs a few tweaks, it enters modification. But if it totally fails to reach its intended beneficiaries, or just becomes completely unnecessary, it faces termination. It hits the chopping block, or gets completely redesigned so those resources can be spent elsewhere.
Which leaves us with a final, pretty empowering thought. This massive 6-stage machine, from agenda setting all the way to termination, it doesn't start on its own. It requires a spark. And often, that spark is public demand. So, what public problem will your voice help solve next? Your awareness and your feedback can literally ignite this exact life cycle anew. Thank you so much for joining this explainer. Keep asking questions, keep looking at the structure behind the solutions, and we will see you next time.